Something extraordinary just happened in Namibia. A nation most people rarely hear about has just done something that shook the entire African continent. In one single day, not a month, not a year, President Nandin Dtoir paid off $750 million euros of national debt. Gone. Finished. Cleared from Namibia's books forever. There were no emergency loans from the IMF, no desperate deals with foreign creditors, no mortgaging of future generations, just discipline planning and the courage to say we will do this ourselves. For decades, Africans have been told that their nations are too poor, too unstable, too dependent to ever break free from debt. But this woman, known by her people as the Lioness of Namibia, just proved the world wrong. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't travel to Europe for photo ops. She acted quietly, effectively, and with the calm authority of someone who believes her people deserve better. And the world noticed. Because this wasn't just an economic act, it was a declaration of independence, the kind that echoes through history. Namibia didn't just repay a bond, it reclaimed its dignity. It told the world, we are no one's project. We are a nation. As one elderly Namibian teacher said on the day of the announcement, "For the first time in my life, I feel like my country stands tall." But this moment also raises uncomfortable questions for the rest of Africa and for the world watching. If Namibia can pay its debts with integrity, if a woman can lead with courage and results, then what's stopping everyone else? So stay with us, because in the next few minutes we'll explore how one leader's silent revolution is rewriting Africa's destiny and why her story is already being compared to Captain Ibrahim Traoré's Burkina Faso. Please share if you believe that true independence begins when a nation stands on its own. Subscribe if you believe that truth and dignity matter more than headlines. It began with a simple announcement from Namibia's Ministry of Finance. No fireworks, no parade, just a woman standing at a podium. Finance Minister Erica Shafadar, her voice steady, her message historic. As of today, Namibia has fully repaid its €750 million bond. For a few seconds, the room was silent. Then applause broke out, not the polite kind you hear at official ceremonies, but a raw, trembling wave of disbelief and pride. People realized they were witnessing something no African nation had done in decades, paying off a massive debt without external help. This bond wasn't just any bond. It was Namibia's largest single-day debt maturity in history, issued back in 2015 at 5.25% interest to cover budget deficits and fund infrastructure. It represented years of dependency, sleepless nights for finance officials, and endless pressure from international creditors. And now it was gone, wiped clean. How did they do it? The answer wasn't magic, it was discipline. Months before the payment, President Nandin Dtoir quietly created a dedicated sovereign fund, a savings mechanism fueled by tax reforms, reduced waste, and redirected export revenues from oil and minerals. Instead of running to the IMF or China, she turned inward, mobilizing domestic banks and private investors who contributed $6 billion Namibian in support of their own nation. It was a collective act of trust. For the first time in years, the Namibian people believed that their money would be used for the country's good, not stolen by politicians or swallowed by corruption. When the repayment was completed, the finance ministry revealed something even more profound. 85% of Namibia's debt was now domestic. That number may sound technical, but it means everything. It means Namibia no longer owes its future to foreign creditors. It means the country's economic fate is now in the hands of its own citizens and institutions. It means freedom. Foreign observers were stunned. Economists called it financial nationalism. Others called it impossible. But on the streets of Windhoek, people simply called it justice. Across the country, families gathered around small radios and TV screens listening as broadcasters replayed the news again and again. One elderly farmer was quoted saying, "We were told Africa must always borrow to survive. Today, Namibia has proved that wrong, and yet this wasn't just a financial story, it was a moral victory. Because for generations, debt had been the new form of colonialism, a silent chain that kept nations obedient. Every loan came with strings attached: privatize this, cut that, open your markets, sell your resources. Namibia's act of repayment wasn't just about economics, it was about breaking those chains. President Nandin Dtoir called it the beginning of true sovereignty. She refused to let her administration be defined by charity or pity. While other leaders fly to Paris or Washington to plead for aid, she stayed home working late nights, auditing every ministry and redirecting funds that had been leaking into offshore accounts. Behind the scenes, her team imposed tough fiscal discipline. Government spending was cut by 17%. Luxury vehicle imports for officials were suspended. Oil revenues were capped and rerouted into the sovereign fund. The plan was painful, but it worked. And when the time came to make the payment, there were no delays, no excuses, no negotiations for extensions. Namibia simply paid in full. That single act sent ripples far beyond the country's borders. Because in a world where African headlines are too often about corruption, coups, or chaos, Namibia had just written a different kind of story, one about order, courage, and dignity. Local newspapers captured the mood perfectly with a headline that read, "Namibia didn't ask. Namibia acted." In that moment, President Dtoir didn't just balance the books, she rebalanced the narrative of what Africa can be. The woman who once promised to treat debt as an enemy of sovereignty had delivered on her word. And in doing so, she had turned Namibia, a small, quiet nation at the edge of the desert, into a symbol of what self-respect in governance truly looks like. When the news broke that Namibia had paid off its $750 million Eurobond, the world barely blinked. But across Africa, something electric stirred. In cafes, markets, and classrooms, people whispered the same words, "Did you hear what Namibia just did?" For once, the story wasn't about corruption, coups, or collapse. It was about discipline, pride, and courage. Three things many Africans feared had gone extinct in leadership. At the center of it all stood President Nandin Dtoir, the woman now called the Lioness of Namibia. She didn't hold a grand press conference. She didn't claim divine inspiration or talk about destiny. Instead, she said quietly, "We are not rich, but we are not helpless." That sentence hit like thunder. It was simple, yet revolutionary. Within days, comparisons began flooding social media and news outlets across the continent. Africans saw in Dtoir the same fearless resolve they had once seen in Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, another young, defiant leader who had dared to challenge global powers and reclaim his country's dignity. Both Traoré and Dtoir were rewriting the rules. Traoré, the soldier who expelled foreign troops and declared food sovereignty for his people. Dtoir, the economist who slayed the monster of debt and told the IMF, "We don't need you." Together they formed a new archetype, a leadership born of action, not slogans. And the reaction across Africa was intense. In Nigeria, people remembered the pain of subsidy removals and rising fuel prices. Social media exploded with posts asking, "Why can't our government do what Namibia did in Kenya, where young protesters were being beaten for opposing more loans and higher taxes?" The name Namibia became a chant of defiance. In Zimbabwe, where inflation has eaten through savings and dignity alike, many wept in frustration because they could finally see in black and white that another way was possible. The reaction wasn't just pride, it was envy, a painful kind of admiration that exposed how far other nations had fallen. One Kenyan activist wrote, "Namibia's success kills the last excuse. We can never again say it's impossible, only that our leaders choose not to try." And that was the moment Africa's mirror cracked. For decades, politicians had blamed colonial legacies, global markets, or foreign interference for their failures. But now a small desert nation had proven that integrity, not size or wealth, defines sovereignty. Dtoir's quiet revolution had cornered the continent's ruling elite, those who fly to Paris for photo opportunities while their hospitals have no medicine. Those who send their children to Oxford while local schools crumble. Those who wear $50,000 watches while their citizens queue for bread. Namibia had become their nightmare, a living rebuke to their excuses. The ripple effect reached even beyond Africa. In Europe, analysts called Dtoir's move a warning shot. In Washington, think tanks began discussing the Namibian model, a polite way of saying a country that no longer listens when the IMF knocks. And in Ouagadougou, soldiers in Traoré's cabinet reportedly applauded when they heard the news. One minister was quoted saying, "This is what sovereignty looks like when it's managed with a pen, not a rifle." For African citizens, Namibia's debt repayment wasn't just about numbers. It was emotional validation, proof that not every leader is corrupt, not every government is doomed, not every promise is a lie. It also reignited something deeper: hope. Hope that dignity can still win. Hope that the continent's future isn't forever mortgaged to the past. But that hope came with anger, too. Because if Namibia could do it, why hadn't others tried? How many billions had been lost to luxury projects, fake infrastructure, and offshore accounts? How many generations had suffered so a few could live like kings? Those questions now echo across Africa, louder than any speech, sharper than any protest. And in that sound, in that rising wave of self-reflection, lies the true revolution President Dtoir began. Not just the repayment of debt, but the reawakening of accountability, the moment when ordinary Africans realized that real liberation doesn't come from foreign aid. It comes from leaders who love their country enough to say enough. Namibia's great financial act didn't end with numbers. It began a psychological revolution. For the first time in decades, ordinary Africans were forced to confront a painful truth. If Namibia could pay its debt and stand tall, then maybe their own leaders had no excuses left. In markets, in churches, even in WhatsApp groups, people debated one question: what kind of leader do we deserve? The answer to that question divided the continent. On one side stood President Nandin Dtoir, a symbol of courage, discipline, and humility. On the other stood President Samia Suluhu Hassan of Tanzania, whose story was spiraling in the opposite direction from hope to heartbreak. Both women had risen to power, promising reform and compassion. Both were seen as proof that female leadership could bring moral clarity to African politics. But where Dtoir delivered transformation, Hassan delivered tragedy. During the same months Namibia was paying off its debt, Tanzania was descending into chaos. Opposition leaders were jailed or silenced. Entire neighborhoods in Dar es Salaam lived under curfews. Independent journalists disappeared. And when election day arrived, the world watched as the internet went dark, the most reliable sign that democracy had died. Then came the results: 98% victory for President Hassan. Not even liberation heroes in their prime had ever achieved such numbers. It was no longer a vote, it was a coronation. The contrast was devastating. In Windhoek, President Dtoir stood beside her people, working late nights to audit ministries and redirect every cent she could toward sovereignty. In Dar es Salaam, President Hassan stood behind barricades guarded by soldiers, silencing the same youth who had once believed in her. It was the story of two Africas, one reborn through discipline, one collapsing through deception. And yet it wasn't about gender. It was about character. Dtoir showed that integrity, not ideology, was the foundation of good governance. She didn't need to shout slogans about empowerment. She empowered her people through action. Her policies gave birth to a quiet revolution. Small businesses thrived as interest rates stabilized. New vocational schools opened with local funding, and trust in government began to grow. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, fear replaced faith. Citizens spoke in whispers. Activists fled. Families who once believed in democracy began to see elections as elaborate theater designed to legitimize control, not choice. Across the continent, women who had celebrated Samia Hassan's rise now looked instead to Namibia's lioness for inspiration. They saw in her not just a leader, but a mirror of what was possible, a reminder that leadership is not about gender, but about courage to confront corruption and history itself. Her actions forced a reckoning among Africa's ruling class. The old guard men who had ruled for 20, 30, even 40 years began to feel the ground shift beneath their feet, because Namibia had shattered their favorite illusion that progress must always come slowly, that sovereignty must be negotiated, not seized. And among ordinary people, something even more powerful was happening. Hope and anger were merging. Hope that things could change, anger that they hadn't. Those emotions combined are more dangerous to corrupt systems than any protest or coup, because they awaken the citizen, and once the citizen awakens, the empire of excuses begins to crumble. Namibia had not just paid off its debt, it had rewritten the moral ledger of the continent. From Washington to Brussels, the reaction to Namibia's $750 million repayment was oddly quiet. No headlines, no op-eds praising African fiscal responsibility. It was as if the global establishment didn't quite know how to process what had happened. Because for the first time in modern history, a small African nation had succeeded without permission. In a world where the International Monetary Fund and World Bank act as gatekeepers of development, Namibia's defiance was unsettling. The country hadn't followed the script: no new loan, no structural adjustment program, no foreign advisors. Instead, it simply settled its account and walked away. For those who understood the global system, that silence was deafening. The truth is, the IMF and its partners don't fear debt repayment, they fear independence. Because once a nation learns it can stand on its own, it stops asking for approval. In Washington, think tanks' quiet memos began circulating. Analysts called it the Namibian precedent. Some argued it was a one-off event and anomaly in a continent plagued by corruption. Others worried it could become contagious, especially as neighboring countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger also turned away from Western dependence and toward regional alliances. One U.S. policy expert reportedly said, if Africa starts believing it can self-finance, the entire post-World War II order begins to shift. And he wasn't wrong. Namibia's move challenged not only economic orthodoxy, but also the political psychology of dependency. For decades, aid has been the West's most effective diplomatic weapon, dressed up as generosity but functioning as control. When you owe money, you owe obedience. When you're in debt, your sovereignty is collateral. But what happens when a country refuses that bargain? That's what scares the old order. Because if Namibia can do it, others might follow. And once several nations start paying their debts and managing their own budgets without external help, the leverage of Western institutions collapses. Across Europe, reactions were mixed. Germany, still criticized by Dtoir for the century-old genocide against the Herero, and Nama was caught in an uncomfortable spotlight. A leader of a once colonized nation had stood up and said, "You owe us not as a victim, but as an equal." In African diaspora communities in London, Paris, and New York, the pride was palpable. Elderly immigrants who had spent their lives defending Africa's dignity felt vindicated. "She did what we always dreamed of," one Namibian nurse in the Bronx told a local paper. "She didn't wait for permission." Meanwhile, in the halls of Western finance, a quiet question was whispered. If debt can no longer bind Africa, what will Namibia's achievement didn't threaten global stability, it threatened global hierarchy. Because a self-reliant Africa means a world where the moral authority of the West weakens. For Americans watching this unfold, the lesson is sobering. We often think of leadership in terms of might, money, or military strength. But real power, the kind that endures, is moral authority born from self-reliance. President Nandin Dtoir may never visit Washington, but her message has already arrived. You can't lead the world if you still own its debts. And that perhaps is why the world has gone so silent. The day Namibia paid off its debt will not be remembered for numbers, it will be remembered for what it symbolized. A quiet nation of fewer than 3 million people showed that integrity is still possible in leadership, that independence is not a dream, and that freedom doesn't begin with war. It begins with accountability. But here's the harder truth: the world rarely rewards integrity. President Nandin Dtoir may have freed her nation from foreign debt, but in doing so, she disrupted a system that profits from African dependency. And history tells us what happens to those who disrupt that system. They are isolated, discredited, sometimes even destroyed. That is why this moment demands vigilance. Because for every Namibia that rises, there will be forces determined to pull it back down. Economic pressure, political sabotage, media, smear campaigns, the old tools of control will not disappear quietly. The question is whether Africans and the world watching will protect this new model of leadership or allow it to be strangled before it matures. And this is not just about Africa. It's about us all. Everywhere in the world, people are asking the same question: why does honesty feel revolutionary? Why does integrity look dangerous? Why should a nation paying its debts be considered a threat? Maybe because we've grown too comfortable with corruption, not just in Africa, but everywhere. Maybe because deep down we know that if Namibia's model spread, if more leaders acted like Dtoir or Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, then the excuses of the powerful East and West alike would crumble. That is the true warning of Namibia's rebellion. It reminds us that freedom has a cost, and that cost is courage. The lioness has roared. Now the world must decide whether to listen or to pretend it didn't hear. Because if a small desert nation can lift itself up through discipline and dignity, imagine what could happen if the rest of the continent and the world did the same. So I leave you with this question. Do you believe this roar will echo across Africa, or will it fade into silence like so many before? Please share if you believe that nations deserve respect when they choose self-reliance over submission. Subscribe if you believe that truth, not debt, should define leadership. And comment below. Can we still trust the world's financial system, or is it time to rebuild it from the ground up?